Other than that, I just wanted to say thanks for joining us today, giving up your lunch hour. That's the people attending, and also thanks to Harry for agreeing to talk to us today. So the subject today is how likely is a Six Nations Grand Slam? And our speaker is Harry Snart. So Harry is a graduate statistician and ambassador with the RSS. He's got an MSc in data analytics from Glasgow University, and his dissertation involved hierarchical modelling in Premiership rugby. And today he's going to educate us about the Six Nations and the likelihood of a Grand Slam. So over to you, Harry.
Thanks, Pete. I will start by saying that the probability is now 0 this year. So this is a retrospective based on the start of the tournament. So hopefully you should be able to see my presentation. If you can't, just let me know. So we can ignore that. Great. So in terms of what we'll go through today, I'm assuming that if you've joined this call, you've probably got some understanding of what rugby union is. We'll do a little preamble for the sake of anyone who's just generally interested in sports but not very familiar with rugby. We'll then talk a little bit about the data that I collected for this. We'll then talk through the modelling. So there were two different approaches taken. One was a frequentist logistic regression model. The other was using a Bayesian logistic regression model. We'll compare what the simulated probabilities were from both, and then we'll compare the results to some odds that were published by a bookmaker. The odds were published in January, so it was before the full squad sizes were selected, before some of the injuries became apparent, such as Tupolotto for Scotland, etc. So it's pretty reasonable, obviously, as the tournament's gone on, probabilities and odds get changed. So we're doing it based on just before the tournament started. So for those of you who I'm sure, as I said, surely most of you are familiar with it, but if you're not, the Six Nations is an annual rugby union tournament played by the top Northern Hemisphere sides. So it's played amongst England, France, Ireland, Italy, Scotland, and Wales. It became the Six Nations in 2000 when Italy were added, and each team plays the other sides once in the tournament. So there's only 5 fixtures per year, and you take it in turn swapping who plays at home and away. So, for example, England hosted Scotland in Twickenham this year, which means that they'll go away to Murrayfield next year. Ireland won the past 2 Six Nations, and they come into 2025 possibly as tournament favourites along with France, hoping to get a very rare 3rd consecutive title. They can't get the Grand Slam now. As I said, no one can at the moment, but they're still in the running for winning the tournament overall. We're coming into the last weekend this week, Super Saturday, with all 3 fixtures played on the same day. And at the moment, mathematically, Ireland, France, England, and Scotland could potentially win depending on the fixture results. So what is a Grand Slam? So sides earn league points, individual tournament points, by getting wins or draws. And you can also pick up try bonus points and losing bonus points. So you get a try bonus point if you score 4 tries in a match, and you get a losing bonus point if you lose a fixture by less than 7 points. Sides can therefore still win the tournament, even if they lose 1 or possibly even more fixtures. The Grand Slam is an honorary title, so there's nothing, you don't get anything for it other than bragging rights. And effectively, you get that if you win all 5 of your fixtures. So how often do we see a Grand Slam? The competition is generally pretty fierce in the tournament. Since 2000, there have been 13 Grand Slams out of 25 tournaments, so that's including 2000. So, you know, you'd say that as a rough estimate, around 50% of tournaments have a chance of getting a Grand Slam in any given year. I gathered from Wikipedia a little table here on the number of tournament wins and Grand Slams. So Italy and Scotland have not won since it was expanded to the Six Nations, but Wales, Ireland, France, and England all have a pretty close number of overall tournament wins, although you could say that France and Wales probably have proportionally more Grand Slams than the other sides. A little bit about the data. So the data that was used for this analysis predominantly came from Wikipedia. It's just very easy to parse the data that's on the way that Wikipedia puts it in the HTML. But as well as that, all of the information was then fact-checked on sites like BBC Sport, ESPN, and also the squad lists that were announced on the official sites. As well as gathering the fixture results, there was supplementary information gathered for this. So, for example, the age profile of the squads, under the assumption that, you know, that on average, older squad has more experience in it. Likewise, the number of caps. So the cap is the number of international test match appearances. The number of distinct clubs that the squads in any given year were made up of. So, for example, the top 14, there's 14 top sides in the French league that players could come from, but at the moment it's predominantly Toulouse, Bordeaux, and maybe a couple of other sides that players are coming in from. Ireland, for example, have only got 4 regions, provinces, so their squad is only ever made up of 4 teams, but we often see with Ireland that Leinster make up a very big percentage of their starting team. As well as this, we created a flag for whether or not there was a change in coaching for that year, whether the fixture was home or away, and we also gathered information for the upcoming fixtures in 2025. So just to give a little snippet of how this looked before the data was pre-processed, you can see here that we've got, these are individual player records, so age 25, 29 caps, plays for Dragons. We've got the fixture results from previous years, and then we've got for each year whether or not they had a new coach and what their previous table finish was. As well as that, we then calculated summary statistics. So both the average and the standard deviation for caps and age was looked at. I wanted to explore both because I figured that the spread of age might also be quite interesting, as well as just the average age. And because teams play home or away on a given year for their fixture, there was a little bit of augmentation to the data set here. So we effectively double the number of observations by flipping that home and away around. So for example, in 2024, Wales hosted France at the Millennium Stadium and they lost. We then augment the data set by having France host Wales and then mark that home win as a 1. This just helps to stabilize the model for predictions in 2025. Before I talk through the features and then the modeling, just a couple of observations on the data set as they came into the tournament. So England had the second youngest side in the tournament, but they had probably more caps on average than you would expect for the age profile, which suggests they had a bit of a blend of youth and experience, which certainly we've seen with the likes of Jamie George and Elliot Daly in the squad. France have got one of the youngest and least capped sides, but they've been performing above expectation, and this is given the quality of their side. So they've got arguably the world's best player in Antoine Dupont. Unfortunately, he was injured at the weekend, but they have other fantastic players such as Ramos, Bielbieri, etc. Ireland have the oldest and most experienced side. They're very highly established. There's a lot of cohesion because they only come from 4 sides. But they did have a change in management this year. So Andy Farrell moved to run the British and Irish Lions. And there's a bit of a question mark about whether they are at, near, or potentially past their peak as a side. They've had a bit of a changing of the guards with the likes of the retirement of Johnny Sexton. Italy had a pretty high number of caps proportional to their relative youth. That may be partially driven by the fact that they have a smaller player pool. The professional side in Italy is Benetton. They've had changes in management over the recent years quite frequently, but Casada has been there for at least 2 years now, I think, and there's a bit more stability inside. They've been performing much better, and they actually did quite well in 2024 relative to their previous tournaments. So they came into 2025 hoping to surprise people a bit, and certainly after they drew with France last year. Scotland have the second oldest and one of the most experienced sides. They've also got a very established management with Gregor Townsend. He's been in post for I don't know how long, but they've not won the tournament since it expanded in 2000. They were expected to compete to win last year and the year before, and they didn't hit the mark. The data suggests they may be nearing their peak before a period of rebuilding, certainly with the likes of Finn Russell getting a bit older. Wales are currently in a period of rebuilding as well, and have had some major changes in management. So they had Wayne Pivac leave, Warren Gatland come in, and he's actually left mid-tournament. They underperformed in 2024. However, it's a bit strange because they won the tournament in 2021, so they're a very good side. They're just going through a bit of a transitory period at the moment. In terms of the gathered features for the model, there was a pair plot analysis and a correlation analysis. And if we see here that the target variable is that home win, which is a sort of binary classification model, and we can see here that there was a positive correlation with the age and the caps in the side. There's a negative correlation with your previous table finish, which makes sense because obviously if you came first, it's a lower number, but that's a better result. And then likewise, there's a correlation with the away team's previous table finish, etc. There was also strong correlation between some of the covariates. As you would expect, age and the number of caps is highly correlated because generally as an elite player gets older, they'll have picked up more caps along the way. So in order to counter that, there was a bit of feature engineering done. So there was a composite feature for effectively the ratio between age and caps, which was used. The first model was used, so all of the code was done in Python. Scikit-learn was this model. So this is using Scikit-learn's logistic regression. A little bit of pre-processing on the features. So we did min-max scaling on the numeric features and one hot encoding for the categorical features, which is the home side and the away side. And the model had a predictive accuracy of 73% for 2024. So initially the training data set was 2020 to 2023, with the validation data set being 2024. And then the model was retrained on 2020 to 2024 to then get out of sample predictions for 2025. And actually, anecdotally, I just totted it up before the call. So we've done the first 12 out of 15 fixtures for the tournament, and we're currently getting 75% accuracy on those out of sample predictions for 2025. Using the trained model, you can then use the predict probability method to then generate class probabilities for home and away win. Using that, you can then look at the fixtures for 2025 and you can get an estimate of the win probability. So we see France were quite strong favourites to beat Wales at home. Likewise, Scotland were strong favourites to beat Italy at home, Ireland, and as I said, this is about 75% correct. And we're coming into the last weekend where Italy play Ireland, Wales play England, and France play Scotland. So I think it's probably going to be reasonably accurate for this weekend as well. Now, the problem with just taking these point estimates here for the probability is that's just a single number. And what we wanted to do here was estimate the likelihood of a Grand Slam. And a Grand Slam is won if you get 5 wins in a tournament. So in order to estimate this, we use sort of Monte Carlo methods, and we take the class probabilities for home win and away win, and we randomly sample 10,000 tournaments. So there's a little snippet of the code here. The code is available on GitHub, and there's a link to it at the end of this presentation. But what we do is we use NumPy as random choice, and we seed the choices with the prediction probabilities from the logistic regression model. So we can see here we create a master data frame to store the results of the simulation, and then for each simulation we log which iteration it is. We have the home team and the away team, so we get the fixture for that part of the tournament, and then we randomly select the winner. It's a little bit blurred, but we can see here that by doing this random sampling over 10,000 tournaments, we're then able to estimate the probabilities just by averaging these out. So we can see here that using the probabilities from the logistic regression model, Ireland had about a 15%, 14% chance of getting a Grand Slam, and all of the other sides had less than a 5% chance. To plot this visually, I used a violin plot using the Seaborn package. Now, it was a bit ugly with just the simulation results because obviously we're just returning discrete numbers 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So in order to make this a little bit more visually appealing and easier to interpret, I jitter the points ever so slightly. The one problem with that is it makes it a little bit harder to read the Ireland getting 5 wins because those jittered points get sort of collected near the top. Visually, what we can see here is that England and Scotland look like they're likely to be fighting over that middle table position, with Scotland potentially being seen as favourites to come slightly above England at the start of the tournament. France and Ireland fighting it out for positions 1 and 2, with Ireland slight favourites, and then Italy and Wales fighting it out over the bottom 2 positions. Some of the pros to this approach. So it was simple to generate point estimates using the predicted problem method, and it was very simple to simulate the tournament by just using random sampling. Some of the negatives of this approach is that by using the random sampling, it's assuming that there's a normal distribution around those probabilities for those point predictions, which may not be the case in reality. And we've also made the assumption that there is independence between fixture results. I don't think that's necessarily an issue, though, because these are professional sides and they're coached to try to win the fixture regardless of what's happening. And certainly when you look at previous tournaments, teams may have a big win one week and a big loss the next week, and vice versa. We then going to look at the Bayesian regression model. So this was using the Bambi package. It's reasonably similar to the BRMS package in R. This allows you to use formula type syntax to build a regression model, and it sits on top of PyMC. And you can, if you're not familiar with the package, it's quite easy to work with. So you create the model object, you put in your regression type formula, you select your distribution family, which is Bernoulli, because we're doing a logistic regression, and then we're pointing it here to this historic data set. We can then fit the model by selecting the number of chains and the number of samples. In this case, we're actually effectively simulating the tournament 40,000 times because you've got 10,000 draws per chain. We then can predict from this model. So the inference data is produced by the fit, and you use this inference data to then predict the out of sample fixtures. and you can select the kind as a response. So this is getting the number of wins. When you're using PyMC, typically they use a no U-turn sampler, which uses sort of physics type calculations. So there's a lot of focus on energy transition. So when it comes to validating the fit of your model, one of the sort of holistic ways of doing that is to look at the energy plot, and you get these sort of two distributions here, and you want to be looking for a bit of overlap. So just eyeballing this, it looks okay. It could be maybe a little bit better, but that's probably because we've not got a huge number of samples to work with. By getting the predicted posterior samples, we don't need to use the simulation methods afterwards. So we're able to produce this violin plot directly from the probability, the posterior probabilities. We can see here that it's a little bit more uncertain. There's a bit more spread. France and England are expected to actually perform quite similarly. Ireland is still expected to be probable favourites. Italy are expected to do probably the worst, but only because Wales have that history of doing quite well in 2020, 2021. Now, one of the reasons for this is likely to be shrinkage. So one of the issues with Bayesian regression models is you often get a shrinking towards the mean. There is also potentially a risk of influence from the model priors. When you use Bambi, it pre-selects priors. For the regression model, you can use your own priors if you want to, but if an improper prior is selected, that may influence the posterior probabilities. But the benefits of using this approach is that it allows us to directly sample from posterior predictive, and that removes the need to make an assumption about the distribution of the win probabilities, because that should be covered in the posterior predictive. It also means we don't have to then do further computation with those Monte Carlo samples. When we compare visually the two plots side by side, I'd argue that the logistic regression seems to be a bit more confident. That's probably because we're randomly sampling based on those point estimates. So it's probably taking less information about the past into account. This is obviously taking into account previous years in generating those posterior predictives. So how did the model compare? Well, when you look at the two together and you average out the number of Grand Slams over the tournaments, the Bayesian regression model estimated a lower percentage of Grand Slams. The logistic regression was higher. So when you look at that, between the two of them, it's about 30 to 40% chance of a Grand Slam, which would suggest that if you take that roughly 50% based on that average over history, maybe this year a Grand Slam was less likely than the average year, which would make sense intuitively because France is so dominant at the moment and Ireland are coming into this trying to get a third consecutive title. So there's potentially more competition at the top this year. Ireland were seen as the side most likely to win a Grand Slam. The logistic regression model gave them about 25% chance. France were the second most likely side to win a Grand Slam, but they were only given about a 10% chance. And all other sides were given less than 5%. So whilst they might win the tournament, they were unlikely to win with a Grand Slam. So let's compare the probabilities that were produced against some published bookmaker odds. Now, one of the issues with the bookmaker odds here is that firstly, they're publishing implied odds rather than true odds because they're factoring in a profit margin. And secondly, their odds will change as new information becomes available. They're doing this professionally and at scale. This was a ad hoc task based on a static data set. That said, for the point in time that I got these odds from a bookmaker, I can't remember which bookmaker it was, by converting the odds to probabilities, we can see that they were actually reasonably consistent with our logistic regression model. They thought that any team getting a Grand Slam was about 45% chance, with Ireland as favourites and France as second favourites. It does make you wonder whether or not they slightly inflated the odds for England to draw a little bit of betting from the audience potentially. I think both the Bayesian and the logistic regression model agree that there's a very low chance that England were going to get a Grand Slam this year. And we are here now, so the tournament is almost done. And how's it looking at the moment? So the model was very accurate at the start of the tournament, and it's probably gotten a little bit worse towards the end of the tournament. Maybe that's to be expected. We could have reran the model throughout the course of the tournament potentially. At the moment, Wales are looking like they're going to come last, and they will come last unless they beat England on Saturday. Italy did get a win, so the model suggested that Italy were likely to beat Wales this year, so that's quite positive. Scotland have arguably underperformed this year. Part of that is because they lost to England for the first time in a couple of years in the Calcutta Cup. Ireland have also lost more than was probably expected at the start of the tournament. This may be due to the new players coming in, with the likes of Prendergast coming into the fly half position. England have done better than expected. That was probably the shock win over France that did that, because they did lose to Ireland as expected, but only by about 5 points. So they got a losing bonus point as part of that. And France have been very strong in this tournament as well, although they had that shock loss to England. So I did say it wouldn't take the full hour. We've actually ran through it all a little bit faster than I was expecting, giving us plenty of time for a couple of questions if anyone has any. Overall, we've seen how the regression approaches could be used to estimate the probability of the event being the number of Grand Slams. We've compared how both the frequencies and the Bayesian approaches could have been done to achieve this. Arguably, the logistic regression model had the closest probabilities to published odds. The Bayesian approach had higher uncertainty and gave more of a spread over the possible events. And we've seen that coming into the tournament, the estimated probability of a Grand Slam was lower than what we might normally expect. And sure enough, there's not going to be a Grand Slam this year. So there is a full code to the project that can be found on GitHub, including the dataset. There is also a written article on Medium as well that can accompany the GitHub repository. So with that in mind, I'll stop sharing and open up to any questions.
Thank you very much, Harry. It's a very nice talk. If anyone does have a question, could they raise their hand and I'll try and spot them? I have a few if no one has one, but I'll kind of defer to the audience first. Simon.
Hello there. Thanks very much for that. That was very enlightening. I'm a bettor, but not primarily on rugby, although I do dabble in it. Professional at times anyway. And I'm particularly interested in any insights about age and caps. For instance, at some point, age becomes a handicap. A 40-year-old playing in a international side, so it's not a straightforward relationship, I would have thought. And maybe similarly with caps, I think you sort of acknowledged that a little bit with perhaps sort of an Italy situation where there's a lack of competition for caps. Are you able to expand a bit more on that?
Yeah, I think that was one of the things I found when I was doing the feature engineering, and I found that having that composite measure of age and caps worked quite nicely, because you kind of want a sweet spot between age and experience. And so when that was normalized, I can't remember what the numbers were off the top of my head, but it might be in the deck somewhere. But you're right. Yeah, if a side is too old, that will start to hinder the chances of winning. We could have expanded it further as well by, maybe experimenting with polynomials of age, etc., or interaction effects. But I kept it fairly simple for this particular analysis.
I think we have a question. Oh, sorry, Simon. No, sorry. I think we have a question from Michael.
I think you're on mute, Michael.
Sorry, I was on mute there. With your Bayesian analysis, have you tried varying your prior beliefs a bit to see how sensitive the results are to your prior?
I haven't yet. No, that's definitely on my to-do list. So when I did my my work with Premiership Rugby, that was using the PyMC framework, and you had to specify the priors explicitly. The Bambi framework uses default priors because it's more focused on regression. And I think what I'd like to do is take what I've done in the Bambi framework and use the PyMC framework directly for it, because that will give a bit more control over the priors. But I haven't done it yet.
Thank you.
Anyone else have any questions? If there isn't one, in the meantime, I was going to ask one, Harry. So here you've used logistic regression. Do you think there'd be any value in kind of modeling points directly? Do you think you would get any more information using that sort of approach?
Yes, again, that's what I did with the Premiership Rugby, was modeling of points. And that was based on the work that Dixon did around effectively Poisson distributions for the number of points, and that was based on estimating the number of tries and number of effectively kicking points to then estimate the overall match points in a fixture. I found that was hard to do over a panel series, and I wanted to take into account recent form, so factoring in previous years. So instead I focused on just winning rather than points. And also, because this is only the Grand Slam, you could ignore points because it's really only about who wins. So likewise, it was a binary classification problem because it didn't matter if a draw was equivalent to a loss in terms of estimating whether you're getting a Grand Slam.
Oh, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. I had another very small question. I don't know if you know this off the top of your head. So because you have this fixture split, well, you have 3 home games and 2 away games in any given season for a country. When Grand Slams have occurred, has that tended to be when a team has had 3 home games rather than 2? Do you know? That strikes me as...
So I haven't personally done an analysis, but that was mentioned on, so Ben Youngs has a podcast called For the Love of Rugby, and they talked about that. So Squidge Rugby is a very famous analyst who does a lot of tournament predictions, and he talked about the fact that generally when you've got the 3 home fixtures, you have a higher chance of getting a Grand Slam or tournament win.
I think we have a question from Patrick.
Hi there. Cheers, Harry. That was a good presentation, and thanks for sharing the GitHub as well. I can't remember whether you put it. Did you involve world rankings in it at all, either as a feature or looked at correlation between finishing position and rankings in the past or something like that?
I didn't, but that was my own bias because I'm very cynical about the IRB world rankings. I don't think they're a particularly good measure of a team's success. I probably should have included it though. That was opinionated modeling on my part.
Is your cynicism from data or just your view of the group and the ranking calculation?
The ranking calculation. I don't.
Yeah, okay.
There's a disconnect as well, because the Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere play their seasons slightly differently. So when you have the Rugby Championship, they'll update the IAB World Rankings for those teams, and then there's a bit of a lag as the Northern Hemisphere plays the Six Nations. So it's not perfect when you're looking at just at the Six Nations in isolation. It's probably more accurate when you're coming into the World Cup itself. But I also think generally the way that the rankings are calculated can overinflate certain sides' position. So certainly when you look at Ireland over the last couple of years, they've been consistently in the top 3, I'd say, in terms of world rankings. And yes, they have won the Six Nations, but I think it's not a perfect measure.
Well, all right. Yeah, thanks, Harry.
I got a question from Daniel.
Hi there. Thanks, Harry. It was a brilliant presentation. You mentioned you've done some work on Premiership Rugby as well. In terms of a winning team or a team that scores lots of points, could you draw any comparisons across these two pieces of work in terms of like caps or the number of clubs or age of what makes a great rugby team?
That's a good question. So the work I did on Premiership Rugby was actually, it was very much focused on Dixon's work, which was around hierarchical models that took into account latent attacking and defensive attributes of sides. So it was different to this was more like an ML type project where you gather lots of different features, whereas the other one was more focused on producing those Poisson distributions based on just the fixture results. I think it would be an interesting point to look at trying to marry those different tournaments together, because certainly what we've seen coming into the Six Nations this year is France are expected to do well because Toulouse have been so dominant. When you look at that
Yeah.
Toulouse side in the Champions Cup this year, I think they beat Leicester Tigers by 80 points, which was unprecedented. So there is obviously a very strong relationship, or anecdotally, a strong relationship between the form of club sides. And I think maybe actually looking at just the European Champions Cup might be a good way of doing that, because all of the Six Nations sides have sides that feature in the Champions Cup. So that's probably a good way of doing it.
That's a good point. Do you have anywhere I could read your other work on Premiership Rugby?
Yes, it is on my LinkedIn profile. So
Okay.
the dissertation is on my profile.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Harry.
No problem.
Any final questions? I'll wait 5 seconds and then I'll draw to a close. Okay, I'd just like to say thanks again, Harry, for sharing your thoughts. It was very, very interesting, and thanks to everyone who joined today, giving up your lunch hour. Hope people found that interesting and informative. And yes, thanks again, Harry, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.